Well, one of our GCAD Plus users is having a little difficulty managing this magenta box, and she's a little concerned as how does it appear and how do you use it? Well, the magenta box is appearing here when I'm in model space, and that's why the tab down the bottom says model. To get rid of it, which is her particular problem, you simply right click and pick display on the layout, and you may be able to see a dotted line around the floating viewport. So if that magenta or pink box appears, it's there so that you can arrange your particular view. To get rid of it, which is potentially another problem, you can double click just inside or drag a crossing window across that particular viewport and then deactivate it. So we're now back to normal. What I've done here, I've turned on line weight and I've set a relatively thick line around each viewport and given it a colour. When I'm finished and ready to present, I'd change those back to colour 255. A white on a white background won't show, but it does serve as a way of giving you a guidance as to where the floating viewports are. Now this particular sheet, this is the layout sheet, and it's represents a sheet of paper lying on a desk, which is the grey area out here. If I wanted to work on the typical planting for the wildlife corridor, it's important that I activate it by selecting the correct viewport. To select the floating viewport and adjust the view inside the viewport that you see, just pick a crossing window and select the viewport, and then right click and pick activate viewport, and there we get into model. We're back into the model. We're looking at, in a sense, it's like a porthole and you're looking at a view. And as we showed, to get back to where you were, display on the layout there, and you might be able to just right click inside and deactivate it. But if you couldn't do that, just put a crossing window over the floating viewport. So that shows, I hope. Let's do it again. And a shortcut is sometimes just, and it happens accidentally, which I suspect might have happened in this case. You just double click inside the floating viewport. So if now I was to change things up a bit, and let's just look at the central zone. So what I see in this porthole view, and if I now say display it on the layout, can you see everything's changed in size? And to get back to where we were, we can just deactivate that viewport. To look at this other floating viewport here, it's important to select the viewport first. This is the top viewport, the one we've just adjusted, and there's the bottom viewport. So I've got the bottom one selected now. So when I say activate it, it'll jump, and I can zoom out a bit. You can see it's jumped to another part of the design in model space, so telling me that I'm looking there. So again, display it on the layout, come across here, make sure you select it and then deactivate it. So I suspect all that's happened in this particular instance is there's been a double click on a floating viewport without perhaps the knowledge of what you selected, and someone's just double clicked in that area or selected it and then said activate the viewport. If I return to the layout view here and select the floating viewport, over here in the left hand side in the properties box, that's where you can set the scale. So if I said, say, 250, that would be a 1 to 250 scale, and if I double clicked in here, I could move that around to make sure we're grabbing all the parts of the design that we want to show. show rather. And now we deactivate things. So there we've got a 1 to 250 here. You can still move the floating viewport up to arrange your view maybe a little bit higher. And now the design for the wetland planting and the main design itself looks clear. Now we can add more images to this area, but the layout I think then gets quite complex. So you can have many different layout sheets as we've got here. If we wanted to show the species that have been specified in that typical wildlife corridor, just set up another tab and arrange the view of the wetland here in this floating viewport, and then back to that view of the planting plan, and here images showing species that have been specified. So I hope that if you see that magenta box, you are simply looking at the design which is one-to-one in model space, and you're just arranging your view of what you see inside that box that is coloured magenta, and you can jump back out to the layout. You can tweak things a little. It is possible, although I'm not a fan, it is possible to rotate your view like so. And now when you go back into the layout, things will have altered. But I don't recommend doing that, but let's display that on the layout. And now we've rotated that view. So be a little bit cautious when you're in that space. I would suggest you wouldn't want to rotate things too often. So I hope that clears up this magenta box that sometimes appears by accident. And if you understand that it's just a view of your design, and several of those can appear on one sheet of paper, I hope that solves our users' problem.